When we first arrive on Draenor, we only see remnants of what once was the proud and glorious Gorian Empire, an ogre's superpower spanning most of the continent. The many derelict ruins dotting the landscape draw our curiosity and raise many questions. How did the ogres create such a vast empire? What caused their downfall? In this video, we will take a look at the entire history of the Gorian Empire and the key figures that played a role in it. To understand the ogres, we first have to understand their ancestry. Long ago, in a time long forgotten, Draenor was a planet filled to the brim with the fifth element, the spirit of life, which accelerated the growth of plant life and created the spore mounds, enormous beings who consumed more and more of it. Eventually, they tapped into the element itself and gained great intelligence, which allowed them to work as a single organism known as the Evergrowth. We won't be going into too much detail about primordial Draenor, as that is not the topic of this video, but the key event here is the arrival of the titan known as Agromar to the planet. After witnessing what was happening on Draenor and realizing that if left unchecked, the Evergrowth will consume all life and elements on the planet and leave it a wasteland devoid of anything, he fashioned a giant whom he named Grond and infused with Draenor's elemental energies, setting him against the Evergrowth to restore balance to the planet. Eventually, after a grand battle, Grond fell, and from his corpse a new race was born, the Colossals. From them, yet another creature was created, the Magneron, who eventually, due to the Evergrowth's spore infestation, devolved into Gron, who then mutated into the Ogron, and from the Ogron, Ogres were born. Despite being more intelligent than their Ogron progenitors, the Ogres became their slaves due to being physically weaker. After some time had passed, the descendants of Gron spread throughout Draenor and their numbers increased dramatically. The Ogres, still in slavery to the Ogron, were approached by the Arakoa, an avian race who sought to use the Ogres in order to drive the Ogron out of Talador and claim the hidden artifact caches beneath their lands. They offered to teach the Ogres to use magic and were amazed by how quickly their students had adapted to it. They did not know that the Ogres were distant offspring of the Titan creation Grond, and thus were naturally attuned to the arcane. Perhaps also due to their heritage, the Ogres held special affinity to the earth and could use the arcane to shape it to their will. One of the first Ogre Magi to master their newfound power was known as Gog. Emboldened by his power, he ventured out, but not to fight the Ogron as the Arakoa believed, but rather the Gron, the giant creatures whom both the Ogres and the Ogron revered and treated as demigods. Using the might that the arcane granted him, he single-handedly slew the Gron, but he was not yet satisfied. He slew another, and when he slew his fifth Gron, word of his accomplishment spread like wildfire throughout the Ogre populace. Up until this point, they believed the Gron to be unbeatable, almost as if they were gods, but Gog's feat of strength shattered their beliefs. He showed his people that if the Gron, a mighty demigod race, could be slain, then why do they allow themselves to be subjugated by the Ogron, creatures far weaker than the Gron? Gog's accomplishment earned him the title Gron Slayer, and when he returned to his people, he didn't need to convince them to revolt. They rose up in rebellion, slaughtering their former masters, and although they were heavy casualties on both sides, the Ogres emerged victorious. The Arakoa watched with delight. They could almost taste the power they would wield once the rebellion was over, and they could access their lost relics. But that was not to be. Gog proclaimed himself king and renamed their newly conquered city Goria, the throne of the king, in the Ogre's tongue. When the Arakoa tried to claim the relics buried beneath the land for themselves, Gog banished them under the threat of death should they ever come back. This did not deter the Arakoa. They believed the Ogres to be beneath them, and under the cover of night sought to launch a surprise attack against Goria and claim what they wanted. Things did not go according to their plan. Bolstered by their newly found arcane might, the Ogres pushed back the Arakoa, capturing their leader and killing him slowly to set an example. After this night, the Arakoa raids into Ogre territory were rare. Over generations, the Gorian Empire expanded into neighboring territories. Gron and Ogron were hunted down and slaughtered to pave the way for new settlements. Across the continent, new cities sprang up. The two largest of them were Highmole in the plains of Nagrand and Bladespire Hold in the frozen mountains of Frostfire Ridge, which became military outposts for the Empire. On top of that, a trade network was established over both land and sea to link the capital city with all of its outlying outposts. The capital city of Goria became the center for all Ogre Magi to train and hone their arcane skills. The artifacts of the ancient Apexis Society of Arakoa found under their lands became prized and sought after for their potency and the knowledge they offered. Over time, the Ogre's exposure to raw arcane energies birthed an unexpected mutation in their offspring. Very early, children would be born with two heads, and this seemed to coincide with increased intellect and spellcasting capabilities. Soon the trait came to be viewed as a good omen, and some of the Gorian Magi created spells to recreate this phenomenon in adult ogres. Almost a millennium later, the Gorian Empire was spread throughout the world of Draenor. They had gathered fragments of ancient Apexis crystals which granted them a vast source of knowledge and power. Their leaders, sorcerer kings, were known as the Imperators, and their entire culture and power structures were created in support of magic and their rulers. For centuries they paid the orcs little to no mind, seeing them as unworthy of their attention. But that was soon to change. The orcs' shamanistic practices were considered as amusing by ogres, who treated it as nothing more than petty tricks and the simplest of spells, but that view soon changed when they witnessed an elder orc shaman turning away a flood that would have destroyed an entire orcish village. In this moment, the ogres understood the true power and potential that the elemental magic held. Whilst the orcs treated the elements with reverence and humility, seeking to work in accord with them, the ogres were of a different mindset. The Imperator of that time, Moloch, sent an army into the throne of the elements and claimed it to study and subjugate the elements to their will, which enraged the orcs. Unknowingly to the ogres, the throne of the elements was the final resting place of Grond, the titan construct created by Agromar, and as they probed and examined the site with their arcane spellwork, they were astonished by the raw power that saturated the site. One day, as they were probing the site, their arcane power created a dissonance in Grond's lingering energies, resulting in an explosion that blew apart the temple that the orcs had carved into Grond's skull, and killed every Gorian magi currently inside the structure. Not only did this explosion destroy the orcs' sacred site, it also threw the elements of Draenor to turmoil, which caused huge storms to rage across the world. The ogres, however, were not deterred. Imperator Moloch had seen the power that the elements offered firsthand, and with increased determination sent more magi to study and master their power. The tormented elements cried out for help to the orc shamans, and the clans were stirred into action. They had struggled to calm the elements to no avail, and now came the time for action. The elder shaman of the Shadowmoon clan, Nelgarm, made a plea to all the other clans to act, and they agreed to help, and the orcs marched to war. Their first point of attack was the throne of the elements to stop further meddling with their energies. They caught the ogres by surprise, and the skirmish ended with very few casualties, as the ogre magi retreated from the battlefield. Imperator Moloch, however, retaliated in a violent fashion. He ordered his forces to march on every orcish village they could find and slaughter everyone, every man, woman and child. His goal was to strike fear into the orcs' hearts so that they would never rise against the Gorian Empire. But the result was quite the opposite. The slaughter rallied the orcs to action and gave them another reason to unite against the ogres. They created small mobile groups of fighters and slowly chipped away at the Gorian outposts and fortresses, eventually driving the ogres to retreat into their capital city, Goria. Due to the great defenses of the ogre capital, the orcs decided against a direct assault and instead surrounded the city, content on starving the ogres out. Initially, the ogres believed they could outlast the orcs, as they had an ocean port which allowed them to transport goods on ships, but eventually they realized that the ships were incapable of transporting sufficient amounts of supplies. Imperator Moloch and his magi searched through the troves of Apexis crystals in search of something they could use to break the orcs. After some time, they found an ancient Arakoan legend of something called the Curse of Seath, and experimented on it to use it against the orcs. They succeeded and created a disease called the Red Pox, which was highly contagious and decimated the ranks of the orcs. Nelgarm realized that the disease was not natural but rather created by the ogres, and uncertainty began to spread among the clans. They knew that the Red Pox would cause too many casualties before the city fell. In their desperation, they decided to turn to the unbalanced elements, pleading for help. The elements understood that their cause was just, and that if the ogres were to survive, Imperator Moloch would send his magi to meddle with the throne of the elements and tamper with it once more, and so they agreed to help. As the orcs gathered outside of the city, they witnessed the true extent of the elements' fury, the likes of which they had never seen before. The ground trembled, the sky was covered by a raging storm, and wildfire rampaged across the city, burning down every building and every ship in the harbor. After many hours of this relentless assault, the earth itself opened up and swallowed Imperator Moloch and the remains of the Gorian capital. Only rumors of this event reached the other ogre strongholds, but it was enough to convince them to never again tamper with the elements. Now, at this point, the Gorian Empire is no more, and the various remaining strongholds formed city-states rather than an actual empire, but there is one more noteworthy mention of their legacy. 200 years after the fall of Goria, a race known as Draenei crash-landed on the planet. They found a great location which no other culture had settled, protected by mountains and with access to the sea. Little did they know it had once been Goria, the capital of the Gorian Empire, and no other race settled it due to the events of its downfall. The Draenei did not possess any such knowledge, and so they immediately got to work. They erected the beautiful city of Shatrath, dwelling of light in the Draenei tongue, and this is where the Ogres come in once again. Almost 100 years after the founding of Shatrath, the current Ogre Imperator Hoklon promised his people that he will reclaim ancient Gorian lands. He incited his people to wage war against the Draenei, calling them usurpers. He vowed to his people that Highmol would become the new seat of power for the rebuilt Gorian Empire, and argued that they did not even need to rebuild Goria, as the Draenei had already taken care of that for them. Highmol's aristocracy was eager to reclaim their old lands, and so they supported Hoklon. The Imperator called on all the Ogres and raised a huge army that vastly outnumbered the Draenei defenders, and together they marched on the city. They stood no chance. The initial strike was easily repelled, and as the Ogres tried to fall back and regroup, the Draenei forces chased after them and decimated their army. They cut into the Ogre lines and managed to kill Hoklon, throwing them into disarray. To the Ogres' surprise, the Draenei did not continue the attack, but rather fell back into the city. Then Prophet Velen, the leader of the Draenei, stood on Shatrath walls and told the Ogres that should they choose to turn away now, no more of them shall be harmed. After the Draenei's brutal counterattack, the Ogres needed little encouragement. On this day, all hopes of rebuilding the Gorian Empire were lost, and the Ogres never again launched full-scale assaults on the Draenei.